The day began, as days always did, in an endless haze of dust-laden sunlight. The air in the settlement was somber because everyone knew how much hung in the balance. Crops were wilting in the fields, their leaves turned brittle and brown from thirst. The people had grown thinner, more tired, and weighed down by an unspoken anxiety. Workers in ragged clothes milled about the central square, waiting for a ration that might or might not come. No one wasted energy on words. They simply stared at the battered old pump that used to feed their canteens and fill their buckets. That pump, once the lifeblood of the settlement, stood silent and motionless. The settlement was a cluster of shacks and huts around a rocky outcropping that had once yielded a single, seemingly endless well. Some said it was as old as the oldest relics they had dug up in the desert. Others had claimed the well was a miracle, an anomaly in an otherwise arid wasteland. When travelers came through, traders, explorers, even the occasional brigand, they marveled at the functioning water source in a place that seemed utterly lifeless. Over the years, the settlement grew around it, expanding from a dozen families to nearly 100 people. Rationing was tightly controlled, but rarely questioned, because nobody wanted to risk losing access to the well. As long as the pump hissed, the settlement survived. Yet 2 weeks ago, that hiss stopped. The iron handle, once so smooth from constant use, refused to budge. At first, the older generation of settlers tried the usual fixes, applying fresh grease, priming the pump, even chanting old blessings they believed kept the water flowing. But nothing budged. The handle squealed stubbornly whenever someone pushed, then immediately jammed. Panic took hold. Canteens were nearly empty, and each person's share of water shrank from a meager cupful to just a few precious drops a day. Complaints, once hushed and resigned, grew sharper and more urgent. People demanded answers. They wanted to know how all the water could have disappeared. Connor, a sinewy young man who had lived his entire life in the settlement, had become the silent leader among those distressed. He had never imagined life without the well. In his childhood, he had turned the handle with a boy's playful curiosity. Now he studied it with anger and desperation. While an elderly mechanic named Javin tinkered with the pump's insides, Connor and others dug around the base, searching for cracks in pipes or signs of sabotage. No one found anything. The well had simply run dry. Every day without water, only the deepening cracks in the parched earth witnessed the settlement's slow slide into despair. The settlement's leader, whom nearly everyone simply called the Elder, called a meeting on the third day after the pump broke. He stood on a raised platform, leaning heavily on a wooden staff, face lined with age and fatigue. The entire settlement gathered at his beckoning. Men, women, and children huddled in the oppressive heat. The elder's voice cracked as he addressed the crowd. Their few barrels of stored water were gone. Rations were down to a trickle. If they didn't find water soon, they would have to abandon the settlement. Perhaps some might join roving bands that scoured the surrounding deserts, risking violence or enslavement. Perhaps a lucky few might find a caravan heading to the rumored farmland eastward, but the uncertainty was terrifying. Some had grown old in these huts and knew no life except the one tethered to the well. Connor stood to the side, listening. Next to him was his friend Marisol, short and wiry with sunburnt cheeks. She rested a hand on Connor's shoulder when the elder paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Connor's jaw clenched. He had thick hair that curled around the edges of a sweat-stained bandana. Though young, he radiated a quiet resolve. He didn't want to leave. This was home, and he couldn't stomach the thought of traveling across leagues of cracked desert floor with only a canteen or two of stale water to sustain him. Over the chatter of frightened voices, Connor managed to speak up. "We still have a map," he said, raising his voice just enough for the elder to hear. "The old cartographer's parchment with the symbols for wells, springs, any source of water in the region. We have to try searching them. It might be our only chance." The elder's eyes flickered with a mixture of sorrow and agreement. Though the map was old and possibly outdated, it was the best they had. In truth, no one had ever ventured far to verify the map's reliability. The settlement had never needed to. The well had always provided. Now, faced with the unthinkable, the people were ready to gamble on ancient cartography. If water truly existed elsewhere, it had never been found by any traveler who had stepped through their gates. But desperation leaves little room for doubt. The elder placed a trembling hand on Connor's arm and approved the plan. With a nod, he encouraged volunteers to accompany Connor. After what felt like an eternity, only Marisol and a few others stepped forward. That very afternoon, the small search party gathered provisions for the expedition. Each carried only what was absolutely necessary: a battered canteen, a knife, a few strips of dried jerky, and scraps of cloth to protect them from the sun. Half a dozen people said goodbyes to friends or family who stayed behind. Marisol hugged her younger sister, promising to return with water. Two older men, Emmett and Sadir, joined them, each with enough desert survival knowledge to fill volumes. Finally, Shauna, a young mother forced by circumstance to leave her infant daughter in the care of neighbors, added herself to the group with tear-filled eyes and an unbending resolve. The settlement gathered to watch their departure, the swirling dust forming a ghostly curtain around them as they left. Their first days in the desert were punishing. The sun glared from its zenith as they trudged across dunes and rocky outcroppings. Each footstep kicked up pale dust that settled into their clothing, stung their eyes, and clung to their tongues. They followed the cartographer's markings, uncertain if they were even decoding the symbols correctly. Between them, they carried a single sheet of brittle parchment. Faded ink lines indicated potential water sources, but many of the markings were indecipherable. Arrow-like symbols might mean a river or maybe an old road. Symbols shaped like circles could mean another well. They sometimes disagreed, bickering over the best path to follow. Yet Connor's voice forged consensus. He refused to let infighting derail their shared goal: find water or die trying. On the third evening of their journey, they discovered a seemingly abandoned encampment nestled near a cluster of boulders. Torn pieces of cloth fluttered in the wind. The faint tang of decay caught their noses, and they slowed their approach. A single battered tent stood partially collapsed. A young man's body lay just outside its entrance, arms outstretched in a posture resembling prayer or desperation. Clearly the small group that had occupied this camp had perished. Marisol crouched down to check for signs of life, even though the body's pallor and the dryness of the lips told her what she needed to know. A battered canteen rolled out of the dead man's grip, empty. Connor forced himself to scan the rest of the camp. Shauna found two more bodies huddled together inside the tent. A mother and her child. Their eyes were sunken, lips cracked. The child's tiny fist clutched a cloth doll. Outside the tent, half buried in the sand, was a half-finished trench. It looked like the man had tried digging for water, or for something resembling hope in those final days. Grief etched itself into everyone's faces. This small family had shared their fate, and it might be a glimpse into what awaited the settlement if they didn't succeed. Emmett silently covered the bodies with a tattered sheet, reciting a solemn prayer for the dead. The next morning they resolved to search the nearby area for any sign of an oasis. They spotted what looked like a dried-out riverbed a mile to the east. A thick layer of caked mud filled the channel, cracked like a mosaic. At one point in time, water must have flowed there, but now only dusty illusions remained. For hours they walked into the valley, hoping that in some shaded, hidden corner a trickle might remain. But midday sun scorched away those hopes, and they retreated, exhausted, to the abandoned encampment. They no longer argued about following the map. They just walked, step after step, in the direction it pointed, their spirits sinking with every passing mile. By the time they reached what the map indicated as Water Rock, they were down to the last of their rationed water. The site was indeed a massive natural rock formation, jutting up abruptly from the desert floor, but there was no sign of any moisture. They circled the formation. Its stony ridges cast slender shadows that offered a bit of respite. Connor peered at the ground, searching for any sign of seeping moisture, while Marisol and Shauna climbed a gentle slope to get a better vantage point. All they saw were dusty expanses stretching out in every direction. Sadir, whose weather-worn face gave the impression he had spent far too many years wandering deserts, led them into a narrow crevice in the rock wall. He searched for what he called a seasonal drip line, certain rock surfaces that, when the rains were heavy, collected water in hidden pockets. Maybe even a small puddle might remain in the shade, but as they squeezed into a dark passage, they were greeted by only cool air and emptiness. Their torches flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stony walls. A handful of mineral streaks glowed faintly, but no water shimmered. They tried chiseling at some wet-looking deposits, hoping to extract moisture. All they got were fragments of rock that glistened but shed no liquid. Tired, hungry, and nearly dehydrated, they camped near Water Rock for the night. No one spoke much, and some hardly slept at all. A persistent wind howled through the desert, causing the fabric of their shelter to billow. Every rustle outside made them jump. The memory of the lifeless bodies at the abandoned camp weighed heavily on their minds. Would the same fate befall them here, unmarked and unmourned? Connor stared at the sky, searching for solace among the stars. He remembered the children back home, the trembling families who had placed their trust in him. As the hours crept toward dawn, he finally dozed off, dreaming of green fields and bountiful water. They woke thirsty, their throats parched. Marisol, with her face stoic, passed around the last few drops left in her canteen. The others tried to refuse, but she insisted, her voice cracked. "Swallow it. We need to keep going," she said. Once they had swallowed those drops, each stood, mustering what little strength they had left. Someone had to make a decision. The map indicated there was one more symbol a few miles north, a small well if the cartographer's notes were to be believed. Doubts churned in their minds. They had trusted the map this far, and all it had led them to was emptiness. But the alternative, turning back to the settlement, empty-handed, with no water at all, seemed just as dire. They set out again. By midday, the heat was nearly unbearable, and every mouth felt like sand. Their footsteps slowed to a crawl, and eventually they found themselves cresting a slight rise. On the other side was a gully, carved into the desert floor. In that gully stood a short, squat structure of stacked stones, partially collapsed. It resembled a cistern or a well covering of some sort. Heartbeats quickened. Connor motioned for the group to hurry. They slid down the dusty slope, ignoring the sting of pebbles scraping their leg. When they reached the structure, they found what appeared to be a circular hole, rimmed with stone. A broken wooden cover lay off to one side. Emmett peered over the edge. "Anyone have a torch left?" Emmett's voice was subdued, cautious, as though fearful of steering illusions. Shauna rummaged in her pack, found a short torch, and struck a match. Emmett lowered it on a string, peering into the darkness below. Flickers illuminated a narrow shaft, revealing walls lined with old stone. The flame descended, foot by foot, into a pit that might have once sheltered a reservoir. After a few moments, Emmett spoke in a hushed voice. "There's water down there. It's low, but it's there." No one raised a cheer. Perhaps they didn't trust their own ears, or they were simply too exhausted to celebrate. But slowly a glimmer of hope sparked in their eyes. They fastened a rope to a large rock and lowered a metal bucket. Each creak of rope against stone felt like an eternity. When Emmett drew the bucket back up, they stared at the contents with wide eyes. Water. Murky, yes, with a faint smell of minerals, yet unmistakably water. They scrambled to fill their canteens, drinking in small, desperate sips. A wave of relief swept through them, bringing tears to some eyes. Marisol laughed, raw and breathless, hugging Shauna and Connor in turn. Still, facts were facts. This well was almost empty. The water level looked dangerously low, no more than a couple of feet, maybe somewhere near the bottom. If they took too much, it would be depleted entirely. They had to decide what to do. Did they linger, trying to gather as much as possible? Did they attempt to repair the well so it could replenish slowly over time? Yet the desert's dryness meant recharge was uncertain at best, or did they continue searching for a more abundant source? Their rest that evening was tinged with relief, but also laced with renewed apprehension. They had water now, but not enough to supply the entire settlement. How many times could they lower the bucket before the well gave out? They discussed sending someone back with the water they had collected to provide temporary relief while the others resumed the search for something bigger. But the settlement was far, and traveling alone in the desert was near suicide. They debated traveling together, back to the settlement to confirm everyone was still alive. Then consider a broader expedition, Some argued that going back with only a few canteens would be a cruel joke. Despite the unknowns, a decision had to be made. In the morning, Emmett and Shauna volunteered to return with water for the settlement. They would take as much as they could carry without completely draining the well. They had children and families waiting, and it felt right that they bring what precious water they could. Connor and Marisol resolved to push north, searching for the fabled farmland rumored to lie past the desert's boundary. If they found anything, an aquifer, a natural spring, or even the rumored green farmland, maybe they could arrange a permanent relocation for everyone back home. They carefully filled containers from the well, mindful not to draw too much. The rope creaked as the bucket descended for what might be the final time. Each pull was nerve-wracking. They stopped short of draining the bottom, hoping to preserve enough for the well to slowly rebuild if given time. The water they gathered was cloudy with bits of sediment swirling in it, but it was life itself. They divided the canteens, adjusting the straps so that carrying the weight wouldn't break their backs during the journey. Parting ways felt like splitting a tiny raft adrift on a vast ocean. Emmett and Shauna, laden with water, turned southeast toward the settlement. Connor and Marisol watched them go with aching hearts. They weren't sure if they would ever see each other again. Though fear gnawed at them, they chose to press forward, determined to find a more reliable source of water. The map offered faint hope. Another circular marking lay still farther north, accompanied by a symbol that looked like a small river or maybe a stream. The next few days were a blur of trudging across a landscape that seemed designed to defeat them. Sand-laced winds scoured their skin, and the relentless sun drained their energy. But they had enough water now for cautious sips, which were more out of necessity than comfort. Each dawn they rose stiff and sore, pitting their willpower against the desert's unyielding cruelty. Hope blossomed in fleeting moments, when they crested a dune and saw fresh tracks of animals that might also need water, or when they spied shapes in the distance that could be greenery. Often those shapes turned out to be mirages or rocky illusions. At night they rested under a sky bright with countless stars. The hush of the desert was broken only by the quiet hum of the wind. Connor and Marisol fell into a steady companionship, bound by the knowledge that giving up was not an option. They spoke sometimes of childhood memories in the settlement, the communal dinners, children's laughter echoing off the huts, the sense of rare security that well water had provided them. Their vow remained unspoken but clear. They would return with a solution or die without regrets. On the sixth day of traveling north, they came upon a craggy plateau. The ground rose abruptly, forming a natural barrier. They climbed cautiously, using cracks and ledges in the rock. Upon reaching the top, they expected another tedious panorama of dune and dust. Instead, they noticed a striking band of green in the distance below. Hints of trees, or maybe bushes. Impossible to tell from such a distance, but it was definitely some shade of green. Marisol let out a gasp. They squinted, adjusting their eyes to the brilliant midday light. Was it another mirage? Or could this be the farmland rumored in travelers' tales? They hurried down the opposite side of the plateau, their spirits buoyed. As they drew closer, they saw definite signs of vegetation, a cluster of small trees, patches of scrubby grass. The land flattened, complicating visibility, but they pressed on until they reached a narrow valley. Marisol spotted the glint of water reflecting the sunlight's glare. A stream, small and half-choked with reeds, wound through the valley floor. It was real. They dropped to their knees at the water's edge. Cautious of contamination, Connor tasted a little. It was fresh, or fresh enough. Relief coursed through them, and they drank more deeply, ignoring the bits of silt. The sweet taste of hope filled their mouths. They had found an actual water source, a small oasis. The scattered trees, stunted from desert living, provided shade and the promise of fruit or nuts if given proper care. It wasn't the paradise of lush farmland they had dreamed, but it was certainly enough to sustain a small community, especially if cultivated properly. Senses sharpened by tension, they scanned for signs of other inhabitants. None were visible. They explored carefully. The land seemed unclaimed. The only footprints they saw were from animals, likely drawn by the water. They camped next to the stream, listening to it gurgle softly in the stillness. It was a gentle lullaby that reminded them of how dire their circumstances had been just days before. At dawn, they greeted the sunrise with renewed determination. Connor scratched out a rough map in the dirt, trying to commit the route to memory. They had to find a way to bring the entire settlement here, or at least enough people to build a sustainable homestead. The farmland might be further along, but this place already felt like a gift they could not ignore. Once they replenished their canteens, Connor and Marisol packed up. They knew getting back to the settlement and leading others out here was the next mission. There might be challenges convincing the elder, transporting children, ensuring they could survive the journey, but those challenges seemed less insurmountable than the idea of staying in a home with no water. For the first time in weeks, hope felt tangible. They began the trek back, though this time they had a clear destination, the place they came from, and also the promise of guiding everyone to this newfound sanctuary. They moved swiftly, reversing their path across the desert's punishing terrain. Each morning the memory of fresh water drove them forward. The desert tested them, fierce winds, swirling dust, and searing heat, but they pressed on, the precious liquid in their canteen sustaining them. At last, nearly 2 weeks after leaving, they neared the settlement. The huts still stood, and from a distance, no sign of riot or mass exodus was apparent. Arriving at the gates, they found people in worse shape than when they had left. Faces were hollow, eyes were dull, and children cried out in thirst. Some huts were abandoned, doors swinging uselessly in the breeze. Emmett and Shauna had indeed returned. They had saved many from immediate death with the water they brought, but that small supply had long since run out. Connor and Marisol, exhausted though they were, lost no time in delivering the news. They told the elder and the settlement survivors of the oasis, describing it as best they could. At first, disbelief or fear held some people back. Could they survive such a journey? But necessity dictated that staying put was no longer an option. The well was beyond dead. The settlement had become a tomb in waiting. One by one, people gathered their few possessions. Hope illuminated sunken faces. They left at dusk the next day, traveling mostly by night to avoid the worst of the sun's wrath. Connor and Marisol took the lead, unrolling the old cartographer's map only for reference. In truth, they knew the path by heart now. The train of weary settlers stretched out across the sand, a line of fragile human lives braving an inhospitable land. Some stumbled, but neighbors helped each other remain upright. A sense of community stronger than fear bound them together. After days of relentless travel, the battered group arrived at the oasis. It might not have been paradise, but it was water. And it was life. People knelt at the stream's edge, cupping tiny handfuls to their lips. Some wept openly, tears mixing with water and mud. Everyone saw a future again, however uncertain. The settlement would reinvent itself here. The old huts of their former home might crumble into dust, but that loss was overshadowed by the realization that survival was possible. Children ran, laughter reawakened, and for the first time in what felt like eternity, the horizon looked a little less bleak. Connor and Marisol stood side by side, watching as people refilled canteens, offered water to the weak, and looked around for suitable land to build temporary shelters. The hum of relief mingled with a kind of astonished joy. They had found a new place to belong, forging a future where water flowed and the well would never again run dry without hope of replacement. Here, they would fight for every last drop, and this time, they intended to triumph.